Hey guys, welcome to Forterra Church Online. I'm so glad to get to have you back with us for the next part of the Sunday School series. This series, if you haven't heard what it's about already, let me catch you up. This series is all about the classic Hallmark Sunday School stories that if you were blessed enough to grow up in church, you got to learn as a little kid in Sunday school. But the truth is, we don't teach these to adults very often just for some reason. And I don't think it's a good reason. So we're going to teach them through this series. And the byproduct of not teaching these to adults and only to kids is kind of two things. One, if you didn't grow up in church, you may have never actually had the chance to learn from these incredible stories of God's faithfulness. But the second reason that's unfortunate that we don't talk about these with adults much is that we never learn them in the context of an adult faith. So we think of them as kids' stories that don't have much bearing on our life, but I believe they very much do. And so in this series, we started all the way back in Genesis with the creation of the world, fall into sin, the global flood, Joseph's coat of many colors. We looked at the exodus of the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, the creation of a covenant with him, between God and his people. We learned from Job's story of tragedy and his questions. And then we moved into the New Testament, and after learning about even more stories like David and Goliath, and Daniel and the lion's den as well. That was a fun one. I hope you'll check that one out on our website. But as we moved into the New Testament, we learned that God expresses his faithfulness through the promise of a Messiah, and that promise was realized in Jesus. And last week we saw John's account, one of Jesus' closest friends, written in his book. John wrote a book about his experiences with Jesus. And in that book, he recorded 7 signs. And last week, we learned about the first sign. And we learned that he called it a sign because it points to something. It's a miracle that points to the fact that Jesus is the true Messiah. And so the miracle of water turned into wine at the wedding in Cana was a sign that pointed to the reality that Jesus is the true Messiah. And today we're going to learn about another sign. This is the 4th sign. Now, you might be wondering, why are we skipping numbers 2 and 3? Well, that's because, we're just covering the really big ones and the big stories in the Bible, and while the other ones are not insignificant, we have to pick and choose. Otherwise, this series would take us like 3 years, and I don't want to do that to you. We'll do a series sometime on the 7 signs in John's book, but for today, we're going to be focusing on the 4th sign. And this sign, other than Jesus' death and resurrection, is the only part of Jesus' life that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. There were 4 books written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And all 4 of those men recorded this one event, this one sign, in all of their books. And that's remarkable and important because it tells us that this story is significant. It was significant enough that every person who wrote about Jesus told us about what happened. And so we're going to mostly learn from John's account of this story today, but we're going to take a look at a couple of notes from Matthew as well, because he remembered some things that John didn't include in his account that helped to bring this story more to life. Now, right before this story, Jesus had been ministering to people and healing the sick, and big crowds had gathered around him because word was spreading about the incredible things that he was doing. But in the middle of all of that, Jesus gets some really, really bad news. He learns that his cousin and friend, John the Baptist, had been beheaded as a party trick in this just really terrible story of John the Baptist's death. And Jesus had just learned the news of that. And so he's sad. The disciples are sad. They're all tired from ministering to people. And so they go to retreat to another place. And so that's where we pick up in the story, John chapter 6. It says, after this, Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee or Tiberias, and a huge crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was performing by healing the sick. So Jesus went up a mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. Therefore, when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, "Where will we buy bread so that these people can eat?" He asked this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Then Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also with the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were full, he told his disciples, "Collect the leftovers, so that nothing is wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This really is the prophet who was to come into the world." Okay, so what happened here? Jesus had this big crowd following him around. He had just gotten the bad news of John the Baptist being beheaded. And so he takes a boat across the Sea of Galilee, really kind of more just like a jot across the shore. It wasn't the other side. But because of that, it meant that the people could see him and they followed him around and raced around to where he was going. And so the crowds met him there on the other side. Now, you might expect that Jesus would respond how many of us would. Tell them to all go away and come again another day. But instead, what Matthew records is Jesus' incredible response. It says that as he stepped ashore, he saw a huge crowd, felt compassion for them, and healed their sick. That's a remarkable response. But there was a problem, as the disciples quickly pointed out. This was a desolate place, like a desert, not with sand dunes, but that kind of desolate. It said there was plenty of grass, so it wasn't like an arid place, but it was in the wilderness, the middle of nowhere. And so the disciples knew that. And so Matthew tells us that the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages to buy food for themselves." In other words, Jesus, I don't know if you noticed, but in addition to us being exhausted and sad about John the Baptist, this is a wilderness. And it's past dinner time, and these people are getting hungry. You should just send them away to go get food. They're getting hungry, and we're tired. But Jesus, he suggests that instead of sending them away to buy their own food, that they feed the people. And he asked Philip, "Where will we buy bread so these people can eat?" He asked this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Now Philip, he didn't realize this was a test, and so he responded like you and I might. It says that Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little. That's about a year's or 6 months worth of wages. That's a lot of money, and he's like, look, there's no way we can come up with that kind of money. So Andrew does a quick inventory, maybe hoping that finding some food among the people would help to offset some of the costs. And he reports back a very slim picking in the pantry. It says that he reports back how much is there, and he's basically like, look, this isn't even enough to feed us 13, Jesus and the 12 disciples, let alone everybody else. It says one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy who has had 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" And that's when things got crazy. The disciples told Jesus that he should send the people away, but Jesus tells them to all sit down and stay a while. The disciples told Jesus that people should go and buy their own food, but Jesus recommends that they feed all of the people. And the disciples tell Jesus that there's not enough for everybody to be able to eat, but Jesus turns around and does a miracle. It says that there were 5,000 men, plus the women and children. They did this weird thing. Thankfully, we've moved past this at this point, but they used to just count the men. I don't know why. Just it's a good thing we've moved past that. But there were 5,000 men. If you include women and children, a very conservative estimate would be that there was about 10,000 people present, maybe even as many as 20,000. A huge, huge number of people were gathered here. This was a lot of people to feed. So Jesus takes this lunch from the little boy who had the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he gives thanks, and then the bread and the fish multiply until everyone there not only had some to eat, but until they got to eat enough that they were full. It's this incredible, hard to even wrap your brain around, this crazy, crazy event. And it says that not only did all 10,000 people get fed, but that there were 12 baskets of food left over. And it says that when the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This really is the prophet who was to come into the world." So they saw the sign, and they believed that he was the prophet or the Messiah that was foretold would come one day. So why is this a sign? Why is there a message? What is the message behind this miracle? Why were these people convinced that Jesus was a prophet sent from God to be the Messiah based on this? Why didn't they just assume that Jesus was just a David Copperfield? I mean, after all, that's a natural response. We would all be sounding like Joe Biden. Come on, man. Right? Like, you really think that he didn't set this all up in advance? This has just got to be an elaborate trick, a ploy, a marketing ploy, a publicity stunt. This can't possibly be real. I mean, these are reasonable people. They would be right to respond with some skepticism. You and I would too. If we heard something like this happen today, we'd be like, did it really? Did it really though? These were reasonable people. So why did these reasonable people like you and I jump immediately to being convinced that this was a sign that Jesus was the Messiah? Well, the thing is, a sign points. We learned that last week. The sign isn't the point, but it does point. The miracle was not the message, but the miracle communicated a message. So what does this miracle point to? What does this sign tell us? Well, let's consider this story again. Remember, it was in a desolate place, in the wilderness. The people were hungry, and Jesus miraculously provides food in the wilderness. Now, if you're really familiar with your biblical history, you might already know where I'm going with this. You see, there was a time in Israel's history, thousands of years before this day with Jesus, that the Israelites were in the wilderness, and they were hungry. And we find that this story of the thousands of people hungry in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16. So I'm going to read a selection of verses to you. It says, the entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you. Let the people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. So at evening quail came and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, there were fine flakes on the desert surface, as fine as the frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they asked one another, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. Moses told them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord commanded. Gather as much of it as each person needs to eat. You may take 2 quarts per individual according to the number of people each of you has in his tent. So the Israelites did this. Some gathered a lot, some a little. When they measured it by quarts, the person who gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat. So do you see why these people saw this sign from Jesus in the wilderness, providing bread in the wilderness as an indication that God was once again moving among them? That they were able to tell that this was more than just a Copperfield sort of trick. This was personal. This took something that they had heard about since they were little kids and brought it into their world, into a personal experience that they could see was really real. All of a sudden, God was doing something there in the wilderness, something that seemed impossible, something that looked a lot like the stories they heard about when they were little kids. And I believe that's exactly how Jesus tends to interact with you and I. Maybe you've experienced this. You've heard the stories of God's faithfulness to other people. Maybe in this series, you've heard about God's faithfulness to people throughout history. Maybe you've talked with people who have told you about God's faithfulness to them. And so curiosity has led you to follow just a little bit closer, to mix in with some of the other people who also seem to be interested in Jesus, just so you can try and see for yourself if it's really all real. And some of you have been astounded that as you've done that, you have been met personally with Jesus as he comes to you and gives basically a miracle that you would have never expected and it seemed impossible. For some of you, that was after Hurricane Harvey, when your home was destroyed and Jesus sent some of his people to come and rebuild your home for you. For some of you, that was years after somebody hurt you and you had scars, and either all of a sudden or over time, you find healing and forgiveness for that person through the way that God was faithful to you over time. Some of you, got your wilderness miracle when you were at the end of your rope emotionally, feeling like you can't go any further, ready to end it all, and God sent someone at just the right moment to say just the right words to keep you around, to remind you of just how valuable you are. Maybe it was when you got that job at just the right time. Or maybe it was when your dad was finally willing to speak with you again. Or maybe it was something small. You were at church and something from God's word spoke to you in a way that you hadn't ever experienced before. If you're here today and you're wondering if that sort of thing could really happen for you in your wilderness, in the area that you need God to work the most, I want to encourage you to talk with someone who's walked with Jesus. Talk with someone that you know that seems to have big faith and ask them, where has God given you a wilderness miracle? Where has God demonstrated his faithfulness to you in an unexpected way, in a way that seemed impossible? I've experienced this myself. Many, many times actually. But the time that stands out most to me, I'll remember my entire life. And it was so unexpected, and it seemed so impossible. When I was in college, I battled with severe anxiety and depression. There were weeks I didn't leave my bedroom other than to get food. And even then only when I was really, really hungry. Because my anxiety just kept me locked up and hidden away. Mental illness can really, really be a tough thing. I began to plot how I could end my life. I began to believe that the world would be better off without me. One day I was sitting in a coffee shop in College Station called Mugwalls. And I was upstairs in the corner trying to work on some homework. And my mind was just screaming at me that I would fail at that too. And it got really, really hard, and I was having a really difficult time there in Mugwalls, and I started to tear up, and I tried to fight back the tears as I stared at my cold cup of bad coffee sitting on the table and the homework in front of me. And that's when, for some reason, I opened a new tab, and out of desperation, I searched just simply God and depression. And I expected the search results to give me Bible verses and articles about how God doesn't like depression, about how it's a sign of weakness and sinfulness and not trusting God and not having joy like the fruit of the Spirit should be. I expected that God would judge me for my depression. But instead I saw a link right at the top of the search results. And it was a link to something I had never heard of before called Church Online. And the link promised that there would be people there who cared about me. And so I said, well, I might as well give this a try. So I clicked on the link and I opened up the page, and there on one side of the screen was chat, these people talking with each other. And on the other side, Pastor Craig Rochelle's message was just getting started. And would you believe it? He was preaching about God and depression. And he reminded me in that message that God doesn't hate me because I'm depressed. God doesn't hate me because of the things that I feel, but he has compassion on me. Like Jesus had compassion on those people on that mountainside by the Sea of Galilee when they were hungry. As I watched that sermon, I couldn't hold the tears back anymore. And so I turned my chair to face the wall so nobody would see me crying. And when I did that, one of the hosts in the chat jumped in with this message that just said, hey, if you are here and you need prayer, just click this button. So I thought, well, I think I need that. So I clicked the button. And then somebody prayed with me. And I felt like God was there with me. And then a couple of weeks later, they followed up with me to find out how I was doing. And that was the day. That day in that coffee shop in Mugwalls, when it seemed impossible that anything could reach me, that I was too far lost, when I felt like I was at the end, that's when God showed up in my wilderness. That's when he put me on the path to healing. And so I stand here today as someone who still sometimes finds himself in that wilderness, but also as someone who's been equipped with the knowledge of where peace comes from, of where hope comes from. Because I met and experienced the reality of Jesus as my Messiah that day. And I believe that you can experience that too. It was a sign to me, like this miracle was a sign to those people that Jesus is my Messiah. And if you walk with Jesus long enough, you'll experience that too. Sometimes something big like that. Sometimes in little tiny things. And over a lifetime, you realize all the ways that Jesus was providing for you in your wilderness. In fact, I bet if you look back on your life, you can see how God was looking out for you all along already. So what does this sign tell us? The first thing that it tells us is the same thing it told us last week, and that's that Jesus is the true Messiah. And we know that because he does the same sort of things that God did with the Israelites. But the second thing it tells us is not just that he is Messiah, but what kind of Messiah he is. And the first thing that it tells us that he is a Messiah with compassion. With compassion. That word in the Greek means that he felt for them deep within his gut. Have you ever felt that way? Where you had so much compassion for someone that it just was gut-wrenching for you. That's how deeply our Messiah cares about you. And the ironic thing is that this was a time that maybe the people should have had compassion for him. Think about what he was going through. He was tired. He was hungry. He was grieving. And today is the same with God as well. Think about everything that God sees on a daily basis, the number of murders that he witnesses on a daily basis, the number of terrible things he sees, and how much that must break his heart. And when we really should be having compassion for him, he steps in and has compassion for us. I hope that blows your mind. That the Jesus who was grieving the loss of his sin is the same Jesus who today still grieves the brokenness that hurts us too. And he steps in with compassion for us. That is good news. He's a Messiah with compassion, and he's a Messiah who provides. He didn't just leave them in their need. He didn't just feel bad for them and go, oh, that sucks. I'm so sorry you have to deal with that. But he gave them what they needed. And he does the same for you too. He's done that for me. Now, I'll be honest with you. There are times that it won't feel like he's doing that. Those disciples who were with him, they didn't see how it could even be done. But he did it anyway. And looking back on it, I bet they wondered why they were so confused about why Jesus thought that they could feed all the people. And I've experienced that too, and I bet you have as well, where you look back and you go, why was I so worried? You had it under control all along. So he's a Messiah with compassion, a Messiah who provides, and he is a Messiah for even you. Even you. You see, everyone who was there got to eat until they were full. Not just the people who had their life together, not just the people who had already proclaimed that he was the Messiah sent from God, not just the people who had a beautiful family and a good job, not just the people who behaved themselves on Halloween. It was for everyone. And this Messiah is for even you too. And it was even there. He was a Messiah for even there in the wilderness, in the place where the disciples thought was too far away for anything to be done. It was a desolate place, a dangerous place, a place with no food, no sustenance. And in your wilderness, it might feel the same. It might feel dangerous. It might feel empty, lonely. You might feel hungry, empty, like there just isn't enough for you. But even there, Jesus is still Messiah. So Jesus is not just Messiah, but he's a Messiah with compassion, who provides, who's for even you and even there, right where you are today. So what do we take home from this? That's always a good question to ask at the end of a sermon, at the end of reading your Bible. What do I come away with after reading this, after learning from this? And a good place to start often is figuring out who might you be able to identify with in the story. Well, we can start with Jesus. I think it's pretty clear that we're not Jesus in this story. I mean, some of you are able to work miracles with food. I know, you're incredible cooks. My mom is one of them. My wife, my grandmother, they make incredible food from the most random stuff in the fridge and in the pantry. When I look there and I'm like, there's nothing to eat. They're like, no, look. Here, we can put this together. And all of a sudden, you've got the most delicious meal you've ever had. I think that's a miracle with food. But even they can't feed 5,000 people from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So I don't think Jesus is the right fit for who we identify with in this story. Well, maybe the disciples. But I would argue that maybe that's a better example of pastors. You see, after Jesus multiplied the bread, it was the disciples that passed it out. And that's like the pastor's job, to take what God has given and give it to you. To take God's grace and His truth and His word and His love and give that to you every single week. So I don't know that the disciples are the best fit for who we would be in this story. Maybe the crowds are a better fit. Imagine you in that crowd. Some of you hear this story and you're just like some of the people in the crowd. You hear it and you go, this must be the Messiah, the promised prophet of God. Some of you might just be here because it's interesting and you're not quite sure if you believe it yet. Maybe you're not even sure why you're here. You just happened to be watching this today and you're going, is there a reason? But Jesus gave equally to all of those people. And He is giving equally to you today as well. The same offer is on the table for you, no matter which one of those buckets you fall into. His goodness is poured out to each of us equally today. Now I'm going to take this one step further because I'm going to suggest that perhaps you're not just someone in the crowd, but perhaps you're a specific person who was there in that crowd that day. Maybe you're in the crowd. And maybe you see the people around you who are spiritually hungry, who don't know Jesus well, who maybe aren't connected with His people at church. And perhaps you're like that little boy who we didn't even get his name, who only had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and you're thinking to yourself, like the disciples said, this is nowhere near enough to make a difference. Maybe you're looking at the influence that you have with your friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers. Maybe you're looking at the resources you have, the abilities and persuasive skills that you have, and you go, there's no way that I could make a difference on getting people more connected to Jesus. Maybe you think that what you have isn't enough. But what if you offered it anyway? Maybe you only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Maybe it's not enough. But maybe Jesus wants to blow some minds if you're willing to give Him the chance. Maybe you think that your invite to a friend or a neighbor isn't enough to get them to come to church. Maybe you think that the invite card or the text message to your friend just isn't reasonable to believe that it can move the needle on getting someone closer to God, that it's bound to result in nothing. But maybe Jesus wants to do more than you would ever expect or even think possible. You see, everything you have, your abilities, your gifts, your influence, your talents, your relationships, all of it was given to you by God, and He thinks it's enough. And I don't know about you, but I'm not very inclined to disagree with Him. What if this week we offered God what we have? What if this week we just gave Him the opportunity to do something amazing? What might God do if we just took the step to offer what we have? What would God do this week if you invited your neighbor to church with you? What would God do this week if you gave an invite to your barista, your dry cleaner, your yard guy, your coworker? What might He do? It's a small thing, but Jesus does a lot with small things, doesn't He? I think that might be something for us to reflect on. And in addition to that, to reflect on Jesus' heart, who had compassion for the crowds. They had the wrong idea about Him. Right after this story, they wanted to take Him by force to make Him king, and they didn't let Him do that. The truth is, there's a lot of people out there that have the wrong idea about a lot of stuff. So maybe it's election week. Maybe instead of blasting people that you don't agree with on Facebook and calling them stupid or being more politically active than you are spiritually active, what if instead you had a heart like Jesus and you had compassion for them? What if you saw them as someone who needs to experience Jesus in the wilderness? What if you used your Facebook, your text messages, your phone calls, your conversations with your neighbors, instead of arguing about politics, talking about meaningless things, you instead chose to engage them on a level that might actually make a difference? What if instead you engaged them spiritually, invited them to church? You never know what God might do with your 5 loaves and 2 fish. He might just work a miracle. Something to think about and pray about this week. Let's pray. God, thank you for this story of Jesus, you feeding the 5,000. You are a very good Messiah. You are a Messiah who has compassion on us in our wilderness, who provides for us in our wilderness, who is for even me and even these people watching, and even there in the wilderness, even here, right where we are. You're the same Messiah that you were 2,000 years ago to those hungry people. We praise you for that. We ask that you would give us the same heart of compassion that you had, the same heart that that little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish had. Take what we have and use it, God. We want to pray with bold faith that you would blow our minds with what you want to do with the little bit that we have to offer. It's in your name I pray. Amen. I'll see you guys after this worship for a time of prayer before we close the message. I hope you'll stick around. I'd love to get to pray with you.